So liquidity fragmentation is a problem that if you ever used a bridge, you might have noticed, which is that you don't actually receive the token that you want, or maybe you receive it, but you don't receive the full amount of the token that you want. This is because bridges usually have a representation of the asset that you're trying to bridge. So let's say your quote unquote intent or your action is, hey, send Ether from mainnet to, I don't know, let's say Binance chain, right? So I guess Binance chain doesn't have a canonical representation of Ether because it's not an L2, and it doesn't have a canonical bridge. So if you're a bridge, you're going to be like, okay, like this user wants Ether on Binance chain. Like, what the hell should I send him? Because there is no Ether, right? So in the case of Connext, when these cases appear, Connext, what it does is it means next Ether, which is a Connext representation of Ether. The thing is, obviously, you as a user won't ever go and say, hey, I want the canonical representation of Ether on Binance chain, because obviously that doesn't exist. But you might go and say, hey, I want this specific representation of Ether on Binance chain, because that's the one, let's say, you're going to use to, I don't know, adding to, I don't know, an LP or a lending market or whatever. And that representation might not be the next Ether on Binance chain. So here is the issue, and here starts kind of this issue of liquidity fragmentation, which is Connext to be able to swap next Ether to whatever representation of Ether that you want, or that any users would want to get. They need some liquidity on chain, right? And this liquidity, if it's under an AMM or whatever other, let's say, mechanism to be able to swap it, it has two issues. One is there is some liquidity there that is just sitting idle, waiting for users to just swap into or out to that. And the other issue is that if you're using an underlying AMM or something like that, there are some fees also that comes with these representations. So yeah, that's kind of the liquidity fragmentation issue. If you start adding more and more tokens and more chains, then this becomes a real mess. And if you also start adding more, let's say, non-canonical representations that do have usage on the different chains, then users kind of start getting confused on which is kind of the correct asset to use, or they might have multiple assets that are valid to use on different chains. So this once again increases the liquidity fragmentation issue. With this small intro, let's start. Hey Arjun, by the way.
Hey, awesome. How's it going?
Hey Arjun, wherever you.
Sorry for the delay, guys.
Everyone for
we had a xERC20 user call that honestly just blew my mind a little bit, and I think I just completely, honestly forgot where I was for a minute.
I mean, that's great news. Looking forward to you sharing those news. I think it's not public yet, right?
Definitely not public yet, yeah. But bullish xERC20s, bullish open standards, excited to see that people in the space, that it's starting to happen. Like, I think people in the space are starting to realize that this is an option, and that like there's an alternative option to working with any single bridge. It's working with multiple, like having the optionality to work with anything, and that is fundamentally a wonderful and super helpful public good for the whole ecosystem.
Completely. I think people need to realize as well that X tokens is just standard. It's not like Connext related per se. At the end of the day, it's just looking to push the industry forward.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the big challenges right now is like, because Connext is like the kind of most vocal voice talking about it. It seems like a Connext thing because of it. Now, obviously it's in EIP, and so it shouldn't just be a Connext thing. And I think that that's going to start changing now, soon, because there's just more bridges have started becoming interested in it. More chains have started becoming interested in it. But The sooner that happens, I think the sooner we'll kind of get to the point where we have that that aha moment where people are like, oh, this is an EIP. This is just like a better way to do tokens across chains.
Completely, 100% agree. So before we jump into the big question of what is an X token, do you want to add a little bit to what Skele introed and tell us, Arjun, how do DeFi bridges usually work?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like currently.
Yeah. So bridging is obviously one of the it's just been one of the biggest pain points of the space for years now. The pain points are associated with this weird trade-off space that exists between a few things. One, fragmentation. So making sure that users are not having to deal with 500 different flavors of USDC. I'm sure everyone here has been unfortunately had to go to at least one chain at some point where they've had to deal with the fact that there's any USDC and AXL USDC and next USDC and whatever, a bunch of different flavors that are fundamentally not fungible with one another, and where some of those representations are usable in some apps but not others. So that's kind of one issue. The second kind of point of that trade-off space is around liquidity. So once you do have these fungible non-fungible representations, now you need to build liquidity against them so users can get to the right version or the official version on each chain. Or alternatively, security, right? Where you have you're either locking into a single bridge provider or locking into multiple, but having them all mint the same token. And in that model, you're taking on this existential risk as a token, where if the bridge gets hacked, or if any one of the bridges that you're working with gets hacked, then your token can potentially completely depeg or get inflated to the point where it's worth nothing anymore. There's a very high risk and very low domain space within which you can design. In practice, what this means is that if you're issuing a token, you have one of two options today. You either bridge your token using the canonical bridge onto Optimism and Arbitrum, and then you go and bootstrap liquidity for your token on a bunch of bridges, or you go and you lock into a bridge and mint something like an OFT. Both of those options are bad. Why are both of those options bad? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the security risk of locking into a single project is potentially devastating for your token. And we've seen this happen with multi-chain. We've seen it happen with Wormhole, Harmony, tons and tons and tons of instances where entire ecosystems just completely depeg as a result of a bridge hack. And then beyond that, and then I guess for the other option, if you're using a liquidity-based system, then it's just expensive. So if you're somebody like USDC or ETH, people want to build liquidity against your token, and they will just do it for free. But for most other projects, people bridges are not willing to pay incentives to go and bootstrap liquidity for some longer tail asset. It's just not worth it for them. And so you have to go and pay for that yourself. You have to go and incentivize those pools. And the challenge there is, how do you scale that? So as the number of bridges increases, as the number of chains increases, and that really is the second one is really the important piece that I think people are really starting to feel the pain of now. But as we head towards a world with 20, 30, 50, 100 chains, how do you incentivize pools that have millions of dollars of liquidity on each one of those chains in a way that's actually sustainable? And the answer is that you can't. xERC20 is the third option between those three. And that's, I guess, what we can start getting into as part of the rest of this.
Okay, so let me know if I got this straight, right? So we have multiple bridges right now in the DeFi ecosystem. And every time that I want to bridge a token, for example, if I choose to bridge with any of those bridges, what will happen eventually is that they will mint a representation of this asset that I want to bridge. For example, let's say DAI. I want to bridge with Connext. So Connext will mint X DAI currently, and there will be a pool of liquidity of Connext DAI representation together with a native representation of DAI in that chain, right? The official representation, let's say, right? And then that X DAI of or Connext DAI will get swapped in that pool, but you need to bootstrap that liquidity. And every single bridge needs to make the same bootstrap of liquidity. Am I right?
Exactly. Yep.
So in this scenario, and what we have like right now in the space is that every single bridge share the same problem at the end of the day. And you have this liquidity fragmentation, and you also have like a big amount of swaps that also like have fees and everything, basically taking down, the quality of the every single bridge. How does X token come into the picture? How does X token wanna will try to solve this issue?
So basically, like, if your options are between security or cost of liquidity, so like choose an option that's less insecure or choose an option that's more expensive. Most projects today are heading towards the option that's more like less secure, because the reality is it's people are always willing to pay, are always willing to kind of defer payment on security if it means like having to pay less upfront. That's just like a human thing where like there's a reason why it's like easier to sell medicine than it is to sell insurance. And so I think basically what xERC20 does is provides a third option where instead of making you lock into one single bridge, and instead of you having to go and bootstrap liquidity, you now allow multiple bridges to mint the same token. Now, of course, normally there's a risk here, which is if any one of those bridges gets hacked, now the token can become unbacked. So what xERC20 does is it does one additional step here, which is in addition to being able to mint the same tokens, the bridges also, the token issuer can also limit the amount of tokens that are minted by a given bridge. Not just the total amount, but also the rate at which those tokens are minted. And so now you can constrain the risk of the system per bridge. If you're a token issuer, say you're like Maker, for instance, and you bring DAI across chains in this way, you can say, I want to work with Connext, I want to work with Layer 0, I want to work with Axar, I want to work with whatever, and you can decide based on your analysis of the like relative security of these systems how much you want to allow each system to be able to mint and burn across chains. And so in the event that Connext gets hacked in the system, the total amount that is lost by Maker is equal to the rate limit, the amount of tokens that are mintable by Connext only. It's no longer like Connext gets hacked, all of a sudden the entirety of DAI depegs. It's Connext gets hacked, okay, some portion of DAI supply is now unbacked. Maker can then work to like reback that portion. So it's a much lower risk profile. Now, of course, there's still potential loss that will always exist, but it allows the token issuer to have this like granular control. They can say, okay, this is the amount of loss I'm comfortable backstopping. And most importantly, they can change their minds. Like you don't have to be locked into any one thing forever. So if at some point in the future they decide, okay, you know what, we actually don't find any of these options secure enough, we want to move to something else that has not been invented yet. If we were living in today's paradigm where you had to, using an OFT or something like that, and you were locking into that bridge forever, then there's the only way to move to a new system would be to fundamentally redeploy the entire token. Redeploying and migrating a token is a nightmare. It takes projects oftentimes years to do that. So really, it's at that point, it's like you're just never going to migrate.
So why would, first, how do I create an X token? Let's say I'm a token issuer, I'm Maker right now, and I want to make DAI multi-chain exist natively in every single EVM-compatible chain. How could I go about that?
Yeah. So the nice thing here is like the process is not dissimilar from how you would go about like deploying any token with custom functionality on each chain. You just, Maker basically just goes and deploys DAI on every chain they want to support. And then they set up like the, basically like the whitelist of which bridges can mint and burn that representation of DAI. Now, one thing that's different here from the current process is today, normally what happens is you just kind of deploy your token to one chain, and then people use like a canonical bridge, like a rollup bridge or something like that to get from one chain to another. That model is actually incompatible here because that's actually part of the fundamental issue that exists today for bridging, where in the model where you're just bridging the token through a rollup bridge, the rollup bridge owns the token implementation, right? They mint the version of DAI, like the Optimism bridge mints the version of DAI on Optimism. And because it owns that version of DAI, there's no capacity for Maker to go and actually change it. This is the main reason why Maker didn't do this. They didn't go through the rollup bridges. They ended up going and minted, similar to like what USDC is doing. They went and minted their own version of DAI, deployed their own version of DAI on each chain that is controlled by the Maker protocol itself. At its core, this is effectively what you need to do to deploy an X token. You just go to the xERC20 repo, make any modifications you need to make to the actual core contracts if you want to, and then just deploy them from a factory. And yeah, that's about it.
Is it permissionless? Anyone could create their own. So what avoids me from creating my own representation, my own X token of DAI in Optimism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, what people think, so how do we decide what token is the official token, right? So today, for example, like ERC20s are permissionless. I can today go and deploy an ERC20 on Optimism with a DAI ticker named DAI. I can go and put the DAI logo on it. I can tell everybody, this is DAI. This is actually the official version of DAI. Obviously, no one will believe me. Why will no one believe me? Because social consensus is that that's not DAI. And where does that social consensus originate? It's Maker, right? Ultimately, Maker is the one that decides what is the official version of DAI. We see this in practice. So with Circle, for instance, Circle recently migrated Arbitrum USDC to USDCE, which is like the Circle minted version. How do you know which version is the right one? Well, you just listen to what Circle says, because Circle is the token issuer and they're saying this is the actual right version of the token. Now, of course, it takes time for people to migrate and things like that, but ultimately it is up to the token issuer to decide what they consider to be the canonical representation.
Got it. So, and to recap a little bit, X tokens is not Connext specific, right? For example, if I'm Maker, I want to create my own X token representation, and I want to allow either Connext or any other bridge to mint my X token, I could do it, right?
Yep. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the xERC20 repo and in the contracts, like it's just an extension of ERC20 tokens, and all that extension does is it adds burn and mint as functions. And it adds limits for burn and mint. That's it. There's not really anything else going on. And it's designed to be, I mean, honestly, kudos to the Wonderland team for like thinking through like the burn and mint implementation or like the rate limit implementation, things like that. But really it's like fundamentally designed to be stupidly simple, like simple enough that anybody should be able to look at this and say, okay, I can reason very easily about what this does. And it's not something that is like intrinsically increasing the amount of risk to the system, like from an implementation perspective, beyond what I would normally take on with like any other ERC20. And fundamentally, that means it's not in any way associated with Connext or anything. It's just anybody can call that burn. Anybody who is whitelisted can call that burn interface. Doesn't even need to be a bridge.
Got it. And is every bridge pushing forward this implementation? How is this going?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in general, one thing that I've seen is that, so unfortunately, bridging in general is just in a very PvP state right now, where everybody's trying to figure out how to get to PMF. There is really very little traction in the bridging space, and like there are just too many projects that have gotten VC funding, and so people are trying to figure out like how they survive. It makes sense. This is just kind of the nature of bear markets. That said, this is a solution, or this is a standard that actually benefits everybody. Like it just removes the need for anybody to think about liquidity. It improves how people can bootstrap and go to other chains. So what we've got from like talking to other bridges, talking to other ecosystems, we've seen generally that people are actually very in favor of this model. There might have like slight differences in the way that they want to think about it or things like that, but generally everybody's actually on board with this standard. And we're seeing now like an increasing number of bridges willing to kind of like talk about that and like market that publicly. But even separately from marketing it publicly, you can see this in practice. So, Layer 0, Axelar, et cetera, have not yet publicly come out in favor or in support of xERC20. However, yesterday, Beefy, like Beefy Finance, the cross-chain yield aggregation protocol, went live with the new version of their Beefy token. The new version of their Beefy token is an xERC20 that supports Chainlink, Axelar, and Layer 0 out of the box. So the kind of proof in the pudding here is that there are already tokens that are launching which support multiple bridges, including some of those other bridges that have their own proprietary token standards. And those other bridges are actively building support for that. And so the kind of evidence here suggests that, like, yes, there is actually a growing widespread support of the standard. Even beyond the third-party bridges, we've seen a lot of interest from like chain teams to build this into their own bridges. My personal expectation is that over time, of course, there are like incentives for like Layer 0 to advocate for doing OFTs instead of doing xERC20s, because OFTs means you're locked into their ecosystem. But I expect that over time, they will all be publicly talking about this as well, because it's just an important part of how we make sure this ecosystem stays sustainable. And also, they will find, similar to Beefy, I'm sure they will continue to find more and more tokens that will just say, no, we actually want to do this in an open way.
Makes total sense. At the end of the day, we're seeing xERC20 as a building block of DeFi, a very basic, as you were saying, building block for everyone to build upon it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's supposed to be like a primitive.
Yeah, exactly. So completely a primitive. I see here Prince Victor wanna ask a question. Do you wanna go for it, Prince? Or maybe that was a mistake.
Hello, sir. Oh.
Okay, no problem. Is there anyone besides Beefy currently using the X token standard? And yeah, how do you see the near future of X tokens?
Yeah, there's a bunch of projects that are already publicly live and have kind of announced that they're publicly live. That includes folks like Alchemix. So Alchemix's ALCX tokens, and then their ALUSD and ALETH tokens use this model or something quite similar to it. I think for ALUSD and ALETH, they're using something similar that they built themselves in-house in the past. By the way, this is a trend that we've kind of noticed, is like a lot of teams, especially smarter teams who have kind of been proactive about thinking about this cross-chain problem and liquidity fragmentation issue, have actually gone and built things that look almost exactly like this. There are things missing usually, like it's usually like part of the solution, so it may not include rate limits, or it may not include the same kind of like semantics around that we use around this concept called the lockbox, which I can talk about in a little bit. But a lot of the core ideas are pretty much the same. Aside from Alchemix, DAppRadar recently went live, and I think last week there's a bunch of kind of like longer tail tokens that have started onboarding, and then there's a bunch more like projects that are kind of in the pipeline that are folks who have reached out to us or who are working directly with us who have either expressed interest or are already building integrations. Naturally, we think that it's going to take time just for the whole space to kind of coalesce around this, because any instance where you're migrating a token is just a really serious decision. But we're seeing that, like, it's really promising that
this space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
There's like a growing number of projects that are willing to kind of move quickly on it. One thing that we've seen is like out of projects that are coming out of, for example, the multi-chain hack. So Alchemix, DAppRadar, Beefy, all of them were just very seriously affected out of multi-chain. Those projects are the ones that are jumping on this the fastest, because they're realizing that was a situation that could have been completely avoided if they had just used xERC20 out of the box. So that's a really good indication.
Let's say they have been using X tokens on that moment. How would they have avoided the situation?
Yeah, well, a few things. So there's two main pain points that they experienced. One was all of the liquidity that they had basically been bridged across chains via multi-chain became unbacked. And so, if for example, there was like $1 million worth of TVL on Optimism that was bridged via multi-chain, all of a sudden that became worth zero. So that was a huge loss. In the xERC20 case, the total loss there would have actually been equal to the amount that multi-chain could have minted or could have burned on that chain, and not the outstanding liquidity. So for example, you could let's take like a contrived example, right? So say there's a project, say Alchemix, for instance, had set up had xERC20s available from the get-go, and they set up a rate limit for multi-chain where users could bridge like $25,000 worth of ALUSD using multi-chain per day. And over time, or I mean, let's even take a higher number, right? $50,000 or $100,000 worth of ALUSD per day. Over time, users ended up bridging $1 million to Optimism. If in the situation that actually happened, where multi-chain got hacked and the multi-chain was the only bridge actually supporting the token and was underpinning the entirety of the value, in the event of the hack, the entire $1 million became unbacked. Whereas in the xERC20 case, only $100,000 would have become unbacked. The rest would have stayed intact. That's obviously just a very, very significant difference. And then even beyond that, there's a secondary aspect of this that was actually really perhaps even more painful for a lot of these teams, because not all of them had a significant amount of capital bridged. But even if you didn't have a lot of capital bridged, so DAppRadar experienced this, for instance, where, and I guess Beefy as well, where they were trying to figure out how do we migrate the token? Because once multi-chain was hacked, now there was a representation of Radar and of Beefy on multiple chains that was technically a multi-chain representation. And that was the representation that was in liquidity pools, it was in dexes, it was in user accounts. And so they had to figure out, okay, how do we actually distribute a new version of Beefy or a new version of Radar to those users? I actually think that Radar didn't have to do this, but Beefy did. And Beefy has had to do a full token migration to actually move off of multi-chain and move onto the xERC20 approach. So if they had xERC20 from the get-go, what that would have meant would have been they wouldn't have had to do that. They would have basically just de-whitelisted multi-chain, and then they would have, if they wanted to, whitelisted some other bridge. And so from a token implementation standpoint, from a available liquidity in pools standpoint, nothing there would have changed. They wouldn't have had to go through this like massive operational hurdle of launching an entirely new token.
So even if you just trust one bridge, it just makes sense to deploy an X token and only allow that bridge and maybe set the rate limit, or even not. If you completely and fully trust that bridge, then you can go ahead and set a gigantic rate limit, which obviously not recommended, but I mean, you could, and then you could avoid what happened, for example, with Beefy and stuff.
Yeah, and that's actually a really important point, that like even if you're a person that's like, you know what, I don't even care about bridging this token, or like I only want one bridge to support it, or I just want to have a representation on another chain, it is still potentially worthwhile to have the xERC20 representation, and because you then own the token, you own control over who actually can mint and burn it and where that value is at any time as a token issuer, which otherwise you don't own. Otherwise, like even if it's a canonical bridge, the canonical bridge owns that for you. And that concept, that core concept that as a token issuer, you should own your own representation on each chain. That concept is called sovereignty, like token sovereignty. We talk about sovereignty in a lot of other places in this space. And this is that same core concept applied to like issuing a token, where you should be if you are a DAO that is creating a stable coin, you should be the ultimate arbitrator of what version of that stable coin is the right one, and which bridges can mint and burn it, and if something goes horribly wrong, what actually happens to it.
Completely agree. Couldn't agree more. So before we go into a couple of questions, I think here Kingfish from Reflexer and Hi and Rai and many others have some questions, but do you want to go ahead and explain the lockbox that you mentioned a while back?
So one of the challenges that exists around consolidating liquidity across chains is so let's take a step back. Like, what does liquidity fragmentation across chains actually mean? You know, at a high level, you can think of it as like, okay, well, each bridge goes and mints their own version of a token. So as I mentioned earlier, like AXL USDC, multi USDC, next USDC, mad USDC, whatever. That is like one place where we kind of see the manifestation of that fragmentation. But that is actually a representation of underlying complexity that exists on L1, on like the home chain. So what do I mean by that? So say, as an example, we take the kind of like the USDC case we talked about, where USDC is bridged from Ethereum. So you have 300 USDC. You bridge it from Ethereum to Optimism, and you bridge 100 USDC through the Optimism bridge. You bridge 100 USDC through Connext, and you bridge 100 USDC through Layer 0, right? And all of these bridges are minting a different representation. So then you have 100 Optimism bridged canonical USDC. You have 100 OFT USDC, and you have 100 Next USDC, which was our kind of like older representation of that was a Connext specific. Obviously, those tokens are infungible against one another. But what happens if, as a token issuer, you had just said, okay, you know what, I'm actually just going to mint the same tokens for all three of those. So instead of getting those three different representations, you bridge tokens into all of those bridges, or you put tokens into all of those bridges, and then you get 300 official USDC on Optimism. At first glance, it seems like everything is okay. The problem is when you try to bridge back, your liquidity is actually spread out between three different bridges on L1. So if you then try to say like you send 150 of that USDC to somebody else, and they try to bridge it out through Connext, they actually won't be able to, because there's only 100 USDC worth of liquidity in Connext. The other remaining 50 USDC has to come from another bridge. That core problem, where the liquidity on L1 being fragmented actually leads to liquidity on L2 being fragmented, is one of the biggest issues that xERC20 also tries to solve. The way that it solves it is actually pretty simple. We basically just use a wrapper. It's basically effectively similar, like we actually pretty much exactly the WETH contract, except for ERC20s instead of not ERC20. So it's basically like the like WSTETH contract. And all we're doing is we wrap, by putting funds into this wrapper contract, which we call a lockbox, and then minting a kind of representation, which is the xERC20 out of it, we make sure that all of the canonical token liquidity, in this case, like the USDC on L1, is consolidated in a single contract. Now each bridge only burns and mints the representation, which is like the xERC20, right? So if we're kind of going through the example again, what would happen in this case is you would go and take your 300 USDC, you would lock it into the lockbox and get 300 XUSDC out of it. And then you would go and bridge 100 XUSDC through Optimism, 100 XUSDC through Connext, and 100 XUSDC through Layer 0. In all of those cases, the bridges would burn the XUSDC. They wouldn't lock it anymore. And you would get 300 XUSDC on L2. Now, of course, it doesn't actually have to be called XUSDC. This can all be abstracted away from the user, but I'm just saying that, just kind of giving that as an example. So now you have 300 USDC on L2. You send 150 USDC to somebody else. They go and bridge it back through, through Connext. What Connext does here is we burn 150 USDC on L2. We don't try to unlock, 150 XUSDC on Ethereum. Instead, we just mint 150 XUSDC on Ethereum. That's kind of like a receipt or a voucher. You then take that voucher back to the lockbox and you use it to redeem against 150 USDC. And so you get back to like what you wanted. Because all of the liquidity is consolidated, it will always work because the number of outstanding vouchers should always be equal to the number of the amount of liquidity in the lockbox. And if it isn't equal to that, but basically the case where it wouldn't be equal to that would be in the case of a hack. And in that case, you're limiting how unequal it could get based on rate limits. I hope that was clear. I know that was a little bit of a deeper, contrived example.
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Arjun. Just to recap a tiny bit, basically the magic thing that both the lockbox and the xERC20 contract does is just provide this very, very simple, let's say, guidance to how should bridges interact with this, let's say, wrapped shared asset that they all have minting and burning permissions too, right? And that's it.
Exactly.
Like, and all these complexity is abstracted away from the users, sorry. So users just kind of just say, hey, Connext, I want to bridge DAI from mainnet to optimism, and then that's it. Connext then grabs and basically handles all this complexity of wrapping the asset, minting, and then like on the other chain, and then when you want to go back, then minting and burning it and just claiming from the ticket, and the user just receives the assets and they don't see any of this complexity.
Absolutely,
so,
yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is all, the whole flow that I described is like what's happening behind the scenes. Now in practice, like all of this should always be abstracted from the user.
Cool.
Users should never have to see anything.
Nice. A follow-up question and something as well to, because I think Kingfish asked something really interesting, which is, okay, like, let's say rate limiting isn't so easy, right, to set up properly, because let's say, as Kingfish pointed, you might have some event that might require a lot of liquidity to go back to the, let's say, home chain or original chain of that asset. And this obviously is something as well, really, really tricky to manage multi-chain as well, because let's say you are a DAO and you live on L1, but your xERC20 implementation is now live on, let's say, I don't know, 100 different domains, correct? And maybe some domains have different as well rate limits or different as well bridges, because some bridges do not support those specific domains. So I guess one question first is, how do you see DAOs or entities managing this kind of multi-chain complexity with the xERC20 tokens?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess the 2 points here being like, in general, there is complexity with managing the tokens, and then and like, you know, potentially accounting for all of the cases, and then how do you especially do that across chain? So regarding the complexity for managing the tokens, so that's definitely the case. The idea here is just like provide like an iteratively better thing, like better option than what exists currently, where today it's like all or nothing. And in this case, you're saying there's something in between, and it's up to you to decide what that something in between is. In practice, that means like, yes, there could be, you know, a liquidity event or something like that, like a token generation event or something like that happens for the token, where you do need to have a very significant amount of rate limits for a short period of time. The DAO can then, after that period of time is over, can and probably should to then vote to like amend its preferences. And so as long as like, there's obviously some additional operational overhead for the DAO to do that, but at least for now, until we can, you know, this is kind of like a bridge for us, pun intended, this is a bridge for us to get to the point where we eventually have like really, really strong, secure systems that we all really trust and we know that like will always work. But until we get there, you know, we can have this, it feels like it's okay to take the trade-off of having some additional operational overhead. Now, how does this work across chains? The cross-chain piece is actually even more interesting. So there's a bunch of different options on the table here. One option, and this is the one that we use for our own DAO and for our own token, is that Connext has built like a full end-to-end kind of cross-chain governance system. This allows for our DAO to control the next token implementation on every chain and like update preferences if needed. It also allows our DAO to do all sorts of things. So like, for instance, the Connext DAO recently voted to like deploy Next tokens into UniV3 on Arbitrum from Ethereum on Arrakis, using Arrakis basically to like generate liquidity for the Next token on Arbitrum. And that happened as like a single transaction that went from like the Connext DAO on Ethereum directly into like Arrakis's vault on Arbitrum. And that's possible because, one, we have this like cross-chain governance system, and two, because the Next token was an xERC20, and so it was totally possible for us to like transfer, you know, I think it was like over $1 million worth of Next in a single transaction with like no fees. So yeah, I think the answer to that is just the domain space like around cross-chain governance is improving. There are solutions that are out there. Connext already has something here that is usable by other DAOs. It's built just as a public good for our own consumption, and like we want other folks to use it. And I expect that over time that whole space is going to become more mature to the point where you won't have to like spend a bunch of time actually, you know, figuring out how to make these tokens manageable across chains. And in fact, already there's like for example, AltLayer has built a an experience for their own rollups where it's possible for like rollup deployers to manage deploy xERC20 support, deploy the actual tokens, and then manage those like tokens as rate limits using a UI. And so now it's like you can get it to the point where it's not even like a technical process anymore. And so
Awesome.
my hope is that over time people will just solve this problem through better tooling.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And also just this is for the, let's say, not so tech savvy users, but I guess, and this is another question, but maybe we can get a little bit more technical here is, okay, what are let's say you're a super shadowy, super coder engineer or whatever, and you really want to get deep into the xERC20 standard and mess around with it, right? Like, for example, for High or for this specific event that you obviously previously know about, let's say where you need to pull a shit ton of funds from all the different chains because the users basically need to repay their debt. What you can do is you can encode that specific scenario in your xERC20. And if, let's say, the recipient is the contract that is handling the repayment of debt for the users, you can just ignore the limits, right? So, and this is also the magic of having an open standard. So as long as you adhere to the interface or the EIP, let's say, you can mess around and you can add a lot of crazy things in between that will make kind of your life easier and just have you kind of avoid all this mess of configuring rate limits, etc., etc. And with that in mind, like, how do you see like X tokens being modified? Like, what can you modify? What can you not change, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So technically, if we're going by the absolute strictest requirements for the standard, the only thing that is actually an absolute strict requirement is that you support the burn and mint interface. And that is a very, very standard mint and burn interface. There's not actually anything beyond that. It's literally just what you would expect to see for mint and burn for really any token that exists today that is minted and burned, which is most stable coins, most kind of like LSTs, things like that. How do I expect it to be modified? So I think one thing that we've seen is like most projects want to have some kind of customizability around their token. Like there's, at least to an extent, like there is a reason to build, if you're building an interesting DeFi protocol that has some sort of like intrinsic mechanism to create a token, most of the time that involves like minting the token. And so from my perspective, I think this is one of the ways in which like the xERC20 approach just kind of seamlessly fits into like what people are already doing, which is like, let's take Alchemix as an example, right? Alchemix is already allowing you to mint and burn ALUSD on different chains. And they do this because their protocol is deployed on multiple chains. And so you can go and like deposit ETH or deposit USDC into their protocol and then mint ALUSD or ALETH. I think the xERC20 burn mint model is not any different than that. And so in this mechanism, all you're doing is you're saying, okay, the token has this mint and burn functionality. I'm going to whitelist my own protocol contracts to be able to mint and burn the token. Because I trust my own protocol contracts, that can have an infinite rate limit. Or if you don't trust the protocol contracts, or if you want to like limit the risk, you can set a rate limit if you'd like. But because you trust those contracts, you can set an infinite limit. Or you can even get more sophisticated and say, okay, for any kind of like, for these kinds of specific actions or workflows, I want to have infinite mint. But for these other kinds of workflows, I don't want to have infinite mint. So that's I think like the design space, like how granular you can get in the design space, which I think is going to be quite interesting. And we're starting to see some people doing this with xERC20s, especially around things like stables.
Is there any UI or something where protocol owners can just change the settings of their own X tokens? Or how do you see that being easily made?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not yet. The setting limits and things like that is not too complex. So, okay, let me take a step back. You could build a UI for it. The challenge is whether or not that UI is actually going to be useful. For a token that is owned by an EOA, where like your MetaMask account owns the token, yes, the UI is helpful. But most of the time, the mint and burn rights controls are actually owned by a DAO. And so in that case, like building a UI means not actually building a UI that's sending the transactions to chain, but instead is just like a transaction builder that allows you to output a transaction that can then go to the DAO and be voted on. That piece doesn't really exist yet. However, there is no reason why you can't just do basic things like use the safe transaction builder. It's not like a specifically designed, like a flow that is specifically designed for that, but it's also not going to be too dissimilar from something like Etherscan.
Got it. It makes sense. And as you said previously, it completely aligns with the cross-chain governance thing that Connext launched a few months ago, where it's very easy for a DAO, for example, to trigger a transaction cross-chain to basically vote on Ethereum mainnet what's the transaction that's going to be triggered in another chain like Optimism. So the DAO in mainnet could vote to change the rate limits of the token in Optimism or in Arbitrum or whatever, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Perfect.
And this is already being used. As I mentioned, like the Connext DAO is actively using this at the moment. There are multiple other DAOs that are onboarding into using this. Unlock Protocol, for example, just announced that they're doing this for their DAO like a couple of weeks ago. There's more that are kind of like just about there in the kind of final stages of figuring this out or like auditing and things like that. So I expect that over the course of the next like few months, you're going to start seeing a lot more DAOs actively doing cross-chain governance in practice, which until now has historically just been something where like it's a little bit hand wavy, like the DAO votes for something and then the team goes and like uses a multisig to make it happen on another chain. I think you're going to start seeing that changing quite a bit, where DAOs will actually be on-chain. DAOs will actually be making all these like very interesting cross-chain integrations and interactions happen.
I think everyone is very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have a personal vendetta against the fact that there are so many chains. It's just so awful for user experience. And like, you know, I mean, I don't think that the many chains part is going to go away, but I think we can fix the experience such that like, as a DAO, you should just be able to interact with your protocol. It shouldn't matter what chain it's on. And you can, you know, if you build this like cross-chain governance rails, you can build so many other really interesting things on top of it, like, you know, cross-chain protocol upgrades. You know, we've actually spent a bunch of time. We spent some time internally thinking a little bit about this, and I think it's going to be it's really funny, and I think it actually is potentially quite interesting, where we could actually use our own protocol to upgrade itself. We can like send messages across chains using Connext, and then have them execute on the target chain that then upgrades the protocol. Or we can use our own protocol to like deploy itself and things like that. And I think that there's a lot that other projects can also do that's like quite similar. And I want to get to the point where like you can have your DAO and your protocol live on one chain. You can just click a button and it can just deploy itself to everywhere and upgrade itself everywhere and like interact with any contract that lives on any chain.
Yes, and we need this to scale to, for example, L3s, the whole L3 ecosystem, new ecosystems and everything, where if we have hundreds of chains, it should be even easier to replicate any changes. And you shouldn't go in every single domain, changing a single setting of your protocol.
Absolutely.
Perfect. If anyone has any other question, we're almost running out of time, but if anyone has any other question you want us to tackle, please comment it below in the Twitter spaces. That'll be helpful. Is there anything else, Arjun, you'd like to share with us about the X token standard?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you're a dev and you're interested in this, or even if you're not a dev and you're interested in this, a couple of resources that are helpful to check out are xERC20.com. It's just like a public page that we put up that gives a very high level of how this works. It has some like animations that can also help in case my like verbal explanation was not very clear, which I'm pretty sure it wasn't. And then separately from that, I mean, if you really do want to dig deeper, I would definitely recommend reading the EIP. You know, that EIP kind of the write-up of that came from a lot of conversations with different token issuers and came from a lot of feedback from Wonderland. And I think that it tries to like cover the exact reasons for why this standard needs to exist, as well as like how it affects different players in the industry. So for example, like what effect does this have on aggregators? What effect does this have on token issuers? What effect does this have on chains? And how does this help the ecosystem coordinate around around supporting this and around having better bridge liquidity? And lastly, how, what are kind of why does this really benefit everybody? Who is this really helping, and why has this been a problem in the first place?
So again, if you want to read more about the xERC20 standard, you can go to xERC20.com, or I believe the EIP is the 7281, right, Arjun?
Yep, exactly.
So just literally Googling EIP 7281 should get you there. You can find it, yeah. Also in GitHub, you'll find it, I'm sure. Awesome. Cool. Is there anything, Skele, do you have any questions from your side? Any other thing you want to mention?
No, nothing. Thank you, Arjun, a lot for joining and for explaining everything with great detail. No worries. Everything that you said was great. Obviously, maybe some people that might lack some context would like to go and research this a little bit more, but it was an extremely interesting conversation. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys so much for hosting. This was a really awesome chat. And hope that everybody got something useful out of this.
Completely, I'm sure they did. And I even myself learned a couple of things. So yeah, everyone,
actually,
if you have any question,
yeah, one response. So Prince Victor, you messaged asking if we could have a Telegram group to talk about this. So if you go to the xERC20.com page and you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a builders Telegram group link that I would recommend joining. It's just a bunch of people that are kind of interested in the standard that are trying to build with it. And there's some really awesome updates that are happening pretty much every day. So yeah, definitely check that out.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks everyone for coming. And again, if you have any questions, you can either go to the Telegram group, the xERC20 Builders Telegram group, or yeah, send a message, tag Connext in a tweet or anything. And make sure to read about the standard xERC20.com or the EIP 7281. And yeah, enjoy. And I'm sure I'm super looking forward for the whole industry to start using this standard at the end of the day.
Amazing. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Bye all.